So it's Christmas here in the States, and so we bought a Christmas tree, and it is
Really?
already shedding needles, and it is the first day of December. So I'm going to have the ultimate skeleton tree by the 25th. The children love it, but I don't think it's taking water at all. So
Mhm.
I really look forward to the family portraits of the. It's going to be a Utah Christmas tree. Actually, it's going to be like a cactus or a different thing. No, Arizona. I'm sorry. It's going to be in Arizona Christmas tree. It's really going to be tremendous. So that's going to be great. The other thing I was going to say, Javier, thank you. Chitan, Michelle and I did a parallax talk yesterday on the relation between art, philosophy, like literature and philosophy that got into story and different things. Javier was there, Dimitri was there, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. I've actually been thinking a lot this morning on the relation between imagination and thought, which, literature trains imagination. It's kind of interesting to think if it's possible to think something that doesn't involve imagination. Like, what exactly, when you think a thought, is that an act of imagination? Now, we tend to say it's not imagination unless it's creative or it's an image, but is it really different in the very medium, the very act that's being done, or is it all imagination? And to me, we tried to kind of point out in the parallax talk that literature and philosophy, art and philosophy, these things are, literature is a form of art, obviously. They're not the same, but they inform one another in profound manners. And I wonder if the very nature of thought itself suggests that, if in order to have an idea, it must be through a medium of imagination. Like there is imagination even when you're thinking like 2 + 2 = 4. Is there a kind of imagination in the thought 2 + 2 = 4? Now, again, we don't tend to think so, because unless I'm imagining a scene out of the Lord of the Rings, we say that's imagination. But is it really? I mean, phenomenologically, it doesn't seem different, right? You're imagining 2 + 2 = 4. I'm imagining going to the Christmas lights later. I'm imagining Lord of the Rings, right? And yet we tend to call one thinking and one imagination. And I'm not arguing they're identical, but they do seem like they're informing one another, which may, in that very structure, further suggest why philosophy and kind of art and imagination go together. So that was something I was thinking about.
But imagination is a very, very tricky issue.
Yes.
I know I've thought about it many times, and every time, a lot. It's almost like I fail at that. Hi, Dimitri.
Dimitri, beautiful soul. Dimitri, we're talking about is all thinking entail imagination, kind of based on the philosophy and literature conversation. And Dimitri was at Parallax, so we had a lot of fun. And it was actually a lot more. Oh, I felt so bad. Before I forget, the one gentleman who asked about modern like forms of art that are good, his second part, I thought he said Harry Potter. And then I literally at 1 o'clock in the morning went, he said Karl Popper, and I never responded to that question. I felt so bad because I have a lot to say on Karl Popper in the relation of rationality and imagination. I felt like an idiot. Like literally at 1 in the morning, I was going, "Did he say Harry Potter? Eli, I believe." I never got to the Karl Popper thought. I said I felt so bad. But anyway, so we were talking about that in imagination thought. But yeah, it's very tricky, Cheetah, and I think about it a lot.
Yeah. So if you think about it, there's a point that you're making, which is very valid, because imagination as such gives you certain wiggle room vis-a-vis reality. If your subconscious psyche has to only engage with reality without this medium of imagination, your psyche will break very fast. It will completely destroy itself,
Mm.
isn't it? Because your psyche needs a certain space to test itself out in that sense, without actually acting in the world. That is how Freud thought about this question of, and if you think about thinking, is a very similar structure. Thinking is an action which is not an action in some senses, isn't it? That you're thinking something, you're testing an action out in reality without actually acting. So if you act everything that you're thinking, you again will break down.
Mm.
So there is a very radical convergence on one level,
Mm.
which we can see. The other side of this, actually, to my mind, is, and I'm just talking, immediately. So
Oh, please,
for
please. It's a very
yeah,
live subject.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and I'm talking, without any preparation or any background on it.
That's our favorite. That's our
Yeah.
favorite kind of thought.
Yeah. So, but something interesting comes out when you do that also.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, if you think about it, imagination is also an escape from reality for a very similar reason.
Mm.
So, and when imagination is used to escape reality, there is a disjuncture with thought that comes in, which is why when Lacan is thinking about truth, he thinks about truth in a symbolic, in
Mm.
some sense. He's thinking about the symbolic as a concrete form of not imagination alone in that sense. And there's a triad there, and we can get into all complex kind of thinking there. But there's a concreteness that comes with the symbolic, which gets missed in the imaginary. Me and Javier was reading a very interesting mystical thinker called Ibn al-Arabi, if you remember, Javier. Who values imagination a lot for truth? Who's trying to argue that imagination is the and I do think that we as a we are standing at a particular point in our history where we actually have forgotten the use of imagination at some level. We cannot understand the realm of imagination for its own self. We always think of imagination in service of something else in that sense. And then there is a lot to be thought through in that gap, in that sense, that at what kind of imagination would emerge when you will associate thinking not with just the symbolic but with imaginary directly, or is that even is there something at stake in that kind of a thinking or not, and what is at stake in it? I guess these are some open questions.
That's outstanding. A few thoughts come to mind in what you're saying. So it's very interesting. Like the word imagination can get into fantasy, fiction, fantasy, desire, imagine, plan. Like there's all these things where the word imagine kind of can fall into these different areas. It could be art. It could be psychoanalytical. It can be like planning for the future. It could be testing. It's very interesting. I wonder, there's a way in which I sometimes wonder if when I ask someone on the street, what does the brain do? The knee-jerk reaction is say think. They'll say it's think, right? I wonder if actually the brain more so imagines and thinks is like more actually secondary to what the brain does, where we're so trained to say the brain thinks when really we should say the brain imagines, and thinking is almost a transposition or a devolution of imagination into thinking. Like mathematics is a kind of lower form of full reality, right? And yet we tend to associate the Enlightenment, the general public tends to associate mathematics with deepest truth, when there's arguments to be made that yes, maybe it's the most in a way reliable truth or non-contingent truth, but that doesn't mean it's fullest truth. Now we have to go through all that, right? So there's a way in which I wonder sometimes if thinking is a lower resolution of imagination, and actually what the brain is primarily in the business of doing is imagine. In the same way that Javier has been doing all this work to kind of basic, and I agree with him, following like a Bergson or whatever, that time is almost more fundamental than space, right? And yet we tend to mentally think that space is more fundamental and then time. And I understand there's then all the space-time argument where they combine them together, so on. But there's a real sense in which we more so live in time, or that time is kind of what we're in the business of more so than space. Because if you didn't have time, space would be a point, right? And yet our brain comes to associate space with primary and time secondary, and we have to work against that. And I wonder if there's something with the brain as well, where imagination is kind of cute and extra, but it's actually primary. And I go back, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. Like you mentioned, there's also, you see like Augustine would emphasize memory. I have the relation between memory and imagination is fascinating to me. And there's a paper, Thinking There and Thinking Here. And I would argue you can't tell the difference between a memory and something you imagine, except by reference from something external outside the image of the memory. That's the only way you can tell the difference. Now I'd have to, that the immanents are actually indefinable within the immanents. Now I have to define what I mean by all that. But it's interesting when you go, like C.S. Lewis basically said, like, there's a lot of theologians who understand that imagination and memory, which are connected, are actually like the deepest realms of thought, in that if you lose that, you're going to lose something really, really important. And then if imagination is tied to desire, then actually you're going to suppress desire, and then that creates all of the problems and pathologies that we've described. But let me pass it to whoever would like to speak. Dimitri, Javier, either one, you could flip a coin, rock, paper, scissors. Dimitri's first.
I'll take the stage.
Yeah, he unmuted.
So this is a very interesting conversation. What comes up for me at first, I'm diving into the early Lacan, and this is a stage at where Lacan saw the image, the role of the image as preventing analysis from getting through. So an example that I like very much that Bruce Fink gives is that imagine you go to a psychoanalyst and you see his bookshelves, and it turns out he has the same books, and you say, "Hey, I see that you have these and these books. I also read them. How nice is that?" Now, as a psychoanalyst, you shouldn't simply identify with that and say, "Oh yeah, that's nice that you read those books and that we have this in common or whatever," because this is an imaginary identification, and this is completely fine and even necessary for friendship, because this is the identification with the small other. Now, of course, the path on which the analysant will go is that eventually he will posit the analyst to be in a position where he is the subject supposed to know, or the big other. Now, of course, the psychoanalyst is neither your friend nor your master. He doesn't tell you what to do, but also doesn't identify with you on an imaginary basis, which is very disorienting to us, to say the least. Because, like you just said, Chetan, since truth is more of a symbolic thing, well, where does the image appear at the place of a symbolic lack to obfuscate this very lack itself? And this is, of course, super interesting to connect to Hegel and his thought on spatiality and geometry and mathematics and picture thought. He keeps on using this word in the phenomenology of spirit, picture thought, this and that. He critiques spatial thinking and geometry as external thought. So that's one thing, but on the other hand, when we look at the ancient Greeks and Pythagoras, for example, those who do not know geometry will not enter the school or whatever. So there's an importance in they thought there was an importance in thinking, to think in a spatially abstract manner. And Chetan, I have a question to you, because how do you think that the symbolic order is like, do you think that you could say that the symbolic order, or like a relation to that, like absolute knowing, for example, is a reconciliation with picture thought and not the dissolving of picture thought? Because it's not like we can simply be against picture thought or whatever. Like, that's not, I don't believe absolute knowing is just like, oh, we reject picture thought because this is obfuscating and this and that. So you do retain it in a way, but you have a different relationship to it in absolute knowing. The way I think about it right now is that picture thought, like, don't assume that I'm correct. I'm just still trying to think this through. But to me, what picture thought is like an immediate, intuitive grasp. Maybe a good way to explain this is, picture thought is something where it clicks. You know, on TikTok and YouTube, there's all these videos where like things fall in the right place, or like you have glue and these pressure things, and it just people like watching it because they are things where things click, like it just falls into place. So I feel like that's something of picture thought, but like notional explication, the self-movement of the concept, is where you're actually juggling with some kind of impossibility, and like the moment it clicks doesn't mean that you arrived at the final and definite truth, but it's just one moment in the dialectic in that sense. So a picture thought, I think, relies on abstract self-identity, which means A equals A.
Fascinating. I can maybe guess something, in sort of in the air. What we have to think about is, when you start thinking about imaginary, say in Lacanian thinking, is linked to the ego in some senses. And the reason for that is that imaginary actually becomes that the process through which you deceive yourself in some sense, in that sense. The very category deception actually is linked to imagination to a large degree. So what you're trying to ask, I think, is what is the relationship of the same imagination now, in its ability to conserve the absolute knowing or say symbolic in, at what point can we find that relationship back to the symbolic through its own gap? And what is at stake in that kind of thinking? Would I be right in articulating it like this for you, Dimitri? First, I would like to ask that.
I think this is a really complex topic.
It is,
really,
which is why I'm asking
really
you. Which is why I'm
difficult.
asking. I don't want to misinterpret you. I don't want to misinterpret you.
I mean, that's look. I will. I think that's the thing with maybe a word with like the real is very relevant here. Is that the moment something clicks is the moment that you register it within your phantasmatic structure, according to psychoanalysis, right? So
Absolutely.
that's where you can actually incorporate it. But then the question is, okay, but can you, like, there is a kind of Hegelian rhythm, abstract, negative, concrete. Is it like that is it supposed to click or not? You know what I mean?
See, the simple answer is, Dimitri, that there's no necessity for it to click. That there's no necessity that this should be conserved in that sense in absolute knowing. But this does not mean that it cannot be conserved.
Wait, what do you mean by this?
That if absolute knowing, does absolute knowing necessarily have to have a brush with the real? Definitely. And to that degree, but does that brush with the real actually always involve that intuitive component? In that sense that it's only when I can initially intuit something that I can know it eventually in absolute real.
Right. Yeah.
That kind of a one-to-one relationship might not work. Doesn't mean you don't have intuitions, doesn't mean you don't have instincts, all of that might be true. But that might not work in that sense. It may not be true that only if you can intuit something, you can know it in absolute, that absolute knowing is possible. In fact, the very fact that you know anything can be developed and brought into relationship with its own contradiction subsequently.
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying, So that kind of one-to-one relationship might not work. On the other side, one can make a reverse argument. The reverse engineered argument that all forms of absolute knowing have to find a relationship back to some form of its own real, some form of its own contradiction. So each form of absolute knowing would have its own picture thought. That might be true. You get what I'm saying? It's not like if I have a picture thought, it will always lead to some kind of absolute knowing. That might not happen in that sense. But each form of absolute, each conservation of absolute knowing might lead back to its own relationship, to its own, real in that sense, which means its own dynamic with its own, picture thought. As you're thinking about it, but I would have to read a lot more on it, to be honest.
Yeah, same here, man.
Talk more about it to you, yeah.
So now I'm fascinated, and then I'll pass it on to Javier. Michelle, Mr. Eba, good to see you today. We were talking about, we did a parallax talk yesterday, Michelle and I, on the relation between literature and art, which was delightful. We had a lot of fun. Dimitri was there, Javier was there. And I brought up this kind of idea of, does all thinking involve imagination? And then the question of how, if you ask someone on the street, what does the brain do? The knee jerk tends to be it thinks. And I wonder actually if we should say the brain imagines, because thinking is almost a lower resolution of imagination. But we tend to associate imagination with fiction and different things, whereas it would actually see imagination is kind of what the brain primarily does, and it reasons from that place. Now I'm very interested in the question of the difference between, say, imagination and picture thought. Is there a difference between those things? Because there's something about where the mistake is, it's almost like you mistake a stage of what Dr. Lass calls a phenomenological journey with absolute knowing. Like you mistake, say, spirit with absolute knowing. Well, then it's like you lose it all, right? Because you can't make that mistake. So there's something about, if we use Javier's language, bad timing of when you fit, of when you find that fit, and the best time for that fit. And there seems to be, to use that language of the click, there seems to be what you want to do is find the click in the no click, right? Or to find the click in the, I kind of think about when you imagine something, you can't imagine yourself. Even if you have an image of yourself, it's not you. And how you have to like click with the fact that you can never be present in what you imagine or what you think. There's always a sort of lack. that is there. And it's almost like picture thought in a problematic way is when you fail to realize that you are involved in that picture thought, or that there's a subject that's part of it, even if it is absent. Whereas imagination, it's kind of funny, if you know it's imagination, then it's almost good because you know you're imagining it, right? That's like the advantage of imagination, is you say, oh, I'm imagining it. And you kind of own the fact you're a creative, like you're creating this imagination, so you know it is subjectively generated. But the problem is when we kind of separate imagination from thinking, then it's almost like we use imagination as a kind of self-deception mechanism, because we say, oh, the subject is involved in thinking over here, but in thinking here, which is non-imaginative, the subject isn't involved. We're just realizing. And that's when we seem to be able to fall into the problematic picture thought that is abstracted from the involvement of the subject. And then if that clicks, quote unquote, if things just click there, then that's a very problematic clicking, because we are doing it in a symbolic order in which that we convince ourselves the subject is not an active participant in that creative act, right? Whereas if it were to click within a schema of where the imaginary, where we see our active involvement in the imaginary, and that is what we would do, then a click in that has to take seriously the fact of the subject's involvement and the subject's creative play in that involvement. So that would almost suggest the danger of clicking in the wrong context. One should not assume that clicking equals it's bad. But then there's another way in which if one can earn the place where it clicks in the absence or in the lack, then you're good then that's good. But that also, I think, it's very interesting, and then I'll pass it to Javier and then Mr. Ebert. It goes to show how in Hegel, picture thought is problematic, but then it's like imagination, or if the brain has to do something with imagination, there's some sort of ordering or sublation of it that is actually necessary to embark in, right? And it's all contingent, right? And that's also where, like in Mr. Ebert's paper on the sublation, on the sublation of mathematics, there's a role of being in becoming. The problem is that often there's not becoming and being, right? So how do they go together? How do you sublate them and things?
Well, thank you guys. Unfortunately, I can't answer much of the Lacanian questions because I don't read that much Lacan.
Get your cat. Your cat can do it.
But I can approach this from a Derridian sense, from Derrida. We have to be careful not to sort of undermine the language systems that we are speaking from when we talk about imagination and thinking. That being said, I have a couple ways that I think we can approach thinking and imagination. One is that it seems like thinking has a tendency to occupy itself within limits. It draws boundaries between a problem must present itself, right? But what's fascinating is that the moment that the problem seems almost inaccessible to a solution, it has reached its point of excess for you. Imagination then takes over as a point of translatability to which you can then move to a solution, another solution. Like the very fact that you can go, hey guys, this problem that we've been thinking about for so long, maybe that's actually not the problem, right? That right there, that little switch, that point of excess that we've been thinking about this problem for so long, is actually an act of imagination right there. Because it feels like to me, when we're thinking about thinking, we're thinking about limits, right? We keep thinking, and then when we reach that limit, imagination takes over because it has to, and makes us rethink that this is actually not a problem. That in fact, there's a bigger problem. And then we do the same thing. We try to reach the excess of it, the limits of it. And then imagination seems to be the mediator that allows us to do translation. Because I think that's the problem with a lot of thinking, is that a lot of thinking keeps talking about problems, and yet they lack the translatability to see that that may not even be a problem. And that's where imagination takes over, in my opinion. And this is like kind of like my influence from Derrida, because Derrida talks about, translation. One of my favorite quotes from Derrida is like when he says that the Pope kind of critiques the Buddhists for you know, being an atheist, and you know, they're basically atheists. And then Derrida responds and says, the Pope believes that God can't be translated. Right? He believes that God can't be translated. So it almost feels like the lack of imagination it's very tied to the lack of translatability. And you even see this with literature where, and I got destroyed in my first English paper because I wasn't having a balance between telling and showing, right? And it seems like imagination is more obsessed with showing, whereas thinking is so abstract because it's telling. It's telling. So there seems to be a structure of language that is very much tied to the way we think and to the way that we imagine. Imagination tries to show us. Thinking tries to tell us.
There is something interesting where we kind of experience the world as something shown or something we're thrown into, which is like imagination is aligning with that. We're thinking, even if I mentioned earlier, a possible lower resolution of that almost has a necessary role to make that intelligible. And then but then the problem is staying in thinking, you know, and believing that's true, as opposed to almost releasing it again, back into the fullness, back and forth, and you have to have that double action. But with that, I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, it is good to see you today. I hope you have been well.
Hello. All right. If you don't mind, I wrote exactly about this for the Nietzsche paper.
Nice.
Which is really hardly, yeah. I'll just skip right into this part that I believe Javier was alluding to, and I think is relevant to the conversation. Essentially, the backdrop we call nothingness is this absented territory of excess that we call the unconscious. So just using that, like the child, the analogy I give is that when we wake up in the morning and we've been sleeping in sort of a cloistered bedroom and it's dark, and then our eyes have to adjust to the excess of light. Sort of the primary operation, the fundamental, most primary operation of the apparatus of the mind is to absent excess, such that we have a diminishment of the overall excess of input, so that we can create literally like space, an abstraction of space within which to think. So we absent the light into sort of an equilibrium and then proceed to be able to see particular things. So anyway, it is upon it is upon this move into absence that the cacophony of existence refashions itself as the silent interior of the subject. The replete absence of the interior as unconsciousness, vis-a-vis the excess of incoming information, overwhelming the subject's limitations, posits the subjective exterior, and in turn marks its interiority. So there's this internal-external split that happens because of this limiting. But this is the part I wanted to get to. This move from excess to the innumerable and simultaneous and hence unconscious operations of the unconscious is not a linear dissipation of the intensities of experience. Instead, the unconscious is absented by excess stimulation, which yields the total saturation of absence. Meanwhile, what we take to be the object within the conscious frame, that the thing we're focused on, is the excess product itself, the unitary moment of conscious focus. That is, the job of the limit is in compressing the overwhelm of information into background noise precisely so that just one aspect of it may be pulled into sharp relief. But here's the point I wanted to make. That object of observation that's pulled into sharp relief, however, is not plucked out of the flux. In the context of imagination, it's my positing that the discrete object of imagination is not pulled out of the flux, but is rather, I think, as Javier was alluding to, is a result of the excess itself. So the way I put it is rather a unitary product of the excess. The singularity of a given moment of excess produces a unitary information to consciousness, which in turn absents the rest. So it's sort of this everything, nothing unified, to use Zizek, a one comprised of two, of which one part is nothing. This collapsing of information is itself what we would call identification, and the resulting singularity of information, identity. So anyway, I love this question of what is imagination and the difference between picture thought and imagination. A very rudimentary way I'm thinking about it right now, that I wouldn't die on this hill, but is that there may be a difference. Thinking about when I'm imagining, it is a compulsory experience. It doesn't feel like I have much agency. I'm along for a ride. And so that's why I say that that the process of imagination is sort of a blooming that produces this unitary frame within the consciousness that produces the image that is the creative image. And it's from allowing, it's like I like to say that, you know, the creative, to get into the creative flow is to make yourself sort of a chalice or a vessel, and to allow an overwhelm to occur and then produce a unitary frame that just keeps oscillating. It's this unitary frame, and then that overwhelms, and there's another thing that comes up, and you're literally coming up with things. Whereas the unconscious sort of picture framing that we sort of just move through life utilizing is likewise, it's interesting because it's likewise not agental or whatever. You're not really an agent. So it shares that in common, but at the same time, you're not really along for the ride either. You're just kind of not there. And it's actually the job of consciousness or unconsciousness to produce that state. That's the whole concept of predictive mind, and that's the aspect I like about predictive mind theory, which is that consciousness really only ruptures into existence when something goes wrong. Otherwise, it's the job of your mind to make you absent, to have everything running automatically. So when we talk about the click, we're talking about a moment at which there's something that was wrong, consciousness is produced to try and sort of figure out what's wrong. And then as soon as we get it, what's actually happening, just like the person who's learning how to ride a bike and falling and learning and falling and learning and falling and suddenly is riding, can't describe to you how, like what riding a bike is. It has now been absented due to the excess of effort. And they've been pickled for the rest of their life now. They'll be able to tell people it's like riding a bike. They simply are now a bike rider. And that's what happens when we sort of get it. It gets matriculated into absence or into the unconscious, where it just sort of exists as an automation.
That was excellent. And it makes me think, I've been recently revisiting a book on self-forgetfulness by Keller, and it had connected it with what you said on the excess. It makes me think of the difference between ignorance, awareness, and self-forgetfulness. So ignorance is like picture thing where you just don't know something. So it's just kind of like you're getting carried away, because I very often in my thinking will have a, you know, what I associate with a Humean structure, where you start somewhere, you go somewhere, and you have to return, but it's not the same. And that's also kind of Hegelian. So you have a kind of ignorance where you don't know how to ride a bike, right? And then you have to enter a place where you're aware that you're trying to ride a bike, but that very awareness is a symbol of not being an expert at it, right? You have to get to the place where you're almost bike forgetful, or you're self-forgetful on the bike. And then that's almost the supreme sign. It's like ignorance, and it could be confused with ignorance because it's a kind of not thinking about, but it's different, right? So there also seems to be this, like you're saying, picture thought where you're just being carried by the immediacy of the images without being thinking about it. I would associate that with the common life I'll talk about with David Hume, where you're just embedded, you don't really think about it, you absorb the secondhand smoke of the community, you think like that, you just kind of get carried along. Well, then you go to a place where you stop getting carried along, and you're like, well, no, let me try to think about things, let me control things, and that would be going to the ivory tower for David Hume, which is actually a necessary step of the process, but the danger is stopping there, where then you think, oh, I'm just going to control everything, right? Or I'm just going to think myself into truth or whatever. And for Hume, you have to go back to a state where you're embedded into a common life, and that would be like a movement from picture thinking to then imagination, we could say, in this structure, where then you're like, no, I have the ability to say control things, but actually I see value and importance in letting things carry me. But I also have the ability to step in when need to stop myself from being controlled by like a totalitarian dictator that comes in and is feeding me secondhand smoke of ideology. Likewise, you actually, when riding the bike, you want your default to be self-forgetfulness, But if you suddenly like hit a speed bump or hit a rock, you want to quickly go, oh, I'm riding, and put your foot down, right? And catch yourself, right? Only so the awareness comes in, but the awareness is a getting you back to self-forgetfulness as opposed to the goal, right? And it seems to be, so likewise, it's like thinking in the schema I'm describing, or philosophy for David Hume, has the role of maintaining your carrying yourself in the world of self-forgetfulness in order to defend it and bring you back to that state of self-forgetfulness. But we tend to, in our brain, we tend to kind of put the awareness or the thinking as primary, or we tend to confuse imagination and picture thought, because I think it is very interesting to think of imagination having something about it where it's pulling you along, right? And maybe there's a kind of subconscious desire of the brain to replace imagination with thinking, or to make thinking primary, because we want to have ego control. We want to have control. And once you start saying that imagination has some sort of importance, oh, well, you have to make space for something carrying you along, and the ego doesn't like that. But then there's also the temptation of the carrying along that is not earned through thinking or earned through awareness. That is just a kind of ignorance that can be problematic. And if people have that, then they are susceptible ideologically to vulnerability and things like that. So it's interesting to think of that. The last thing I'll say is it's interesting, Javier, alluding to Excess and Mr. Ebert's work on the notion that one enters imagination when thinking, fully examines something or thinks through, reaches a limitation, and then wants to move beyond that. So there's something about thinking being like, I don't experience unicorns. And so you're like, darn it, I'm limited by a finite world where there are no unicorns. And when you hit that limitation, then you imagine the unicorn. And precisely because thinking is capable of doing that, that's one of its great advantages, but that's also one of its great curses, because that means thinking can escape concretion. It can enter a realm of pure coherence without having to correspond. And that's when you can get abstraction. That's when you can get so many problems, right? Because you can have thinking that ultimately doesn't have corresponding. So the beauty of imagination is precisely the ability to take thinking beyond itself. But the curse of imagination is the ability to take thinking beyond itself, because then it doesn't have to correspond. It doesn't ultimately have to come back to concretion, which then speaks to that contingency and holding things together. But with that, I'll pass it to whoever would like to speak.
Thanks, Ebert, for a wonderful description, and wonderful Daniel and Javier. I'll just sort of speak some thoughts randomly. And see, one thing is, when you're speaking this question of imagination and time, they both have something automatic about it. If you think about it, space, you have to still move from one place to another. There is a work that is required, as Ebert was saying, there's a failure involved at which point something becomes conscious. So in that sense, you have to do this act consciously in that sense. Imagination almost works automatically. When everything else stops, imagination keeps on working, because that imagination forms that minimal, sort of gap, or the relationship with the gap in that sense. When every other form of processes of relating to that gap fail, imagination still keeps on working, which is why imagination economy is very different from language's economy. Imagination, you can get a lot of things at once without putting in that kind of work in that sense too. It has a very interesting economical structure in that sense, which is why when Ebert is saying, let things come in. You can do that with imagination freely, because imagination has that economy within itself, which say in the order of symbolic order doesn't in that sense. So that is, I think forms that to that degree, relationship of time and imagination can be thought to very, very interesting ways in that sense, through which they can find function in that sense. The other thing with imagination actually is pretty interesting. Javier is right that imagination sort of takes the thinking forward in that sense through its own limits. Where I would slightly sort of modify what Javier is saying is that it is at that point imagination becomes visible to us. It's not that imagination is that minimal relationship with the gap. Though any time you have to think something, you have to find a relationship with the gap, and you have to start with some image eventually, which is why images are so primal to human beings. When you watch a film, you immediately believe what they're saying, because images have that that kind of a relationship with our thinking in that sense. So imagination becomes visible at that moment to us because it can push that boundary. And as Daniel rightly said, it's a pharmacological structure in that sense that, it can be a curse and a boon both. You're pushing your thinking and you go too far, and again you lose that, relationship, or you actually come closer to, your own contradiction and so on and so forth. I think there's some very interesting play going on here, which we need to think about. Yeah.
Excellent. I'll pass it to Mr. Eber, Dimitri, and Javier. And I wonder, is it something where thinking is thinking space and imagination is thinking time? Like there's something where imagination is generated because we experience time, and thinking is difficult, right? Because thinking is like an umbrella term, but then there's like thinking the immediate bookshelf, or what is that, empiricism? I'm trying to think. There's something with the language here that's tricky. But let me, Eber, Dimitri, and Javier.
Yeah, this issue of gaps that Chitan brought up is super, super important and delicate. Very, very briefly, like what I love is this story of Eisenstein's montage, which Eisenstein, the famous Battleship Potemkin director and pioneer of cinema, and his whole theory of montage is just very obvious, but is simply that the assortment of images are essentially, when taken at face value, totally random. So you have a woman smiling, a picture of a bird, back to the woman frowning. Doesn't mean anything unless you fill in the gaps. And the entire process of imagination is not the images themselves, but the images produced by the absence of imagery. And I don't even know if we can say necessarily images produced by the absence of imagery, but the sensation or the narrative produced by the absence of imagery. So anyway, there's something very, 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 very important about the gaps. Now, how are those gaps produced? They're produced by limitations of consciousness, limitations of mind. They can be produced artificially by an artist. In fact, the difference in a lot of ways between the novel and the poem is that the poet presents more gaps. That's essentially the most fundamental difference. I can read stuff. I could take a novel and turn it into poetry just by eliminating, cartilage. And what that does is invite the reader to imagination. So those gaps sort of require the presence of imagination and engage the reader at a higher level. Last thing I was going to say is that if I can fucking remember what it was. Oh, so the interesting where it gets more complicated, I think, is for me, in my thinking, is that we also produce the gaps as the unconscious. So we are producing, we are limited. So we have that sort of limitation, that first negativity, but we produce a second negativity by absenting the excess information within the limits that cannot comprehend that excess. So we end up with this secondary absence that we often mistake for just plain lack. But what it really is a replete, engorged absence. And that absence alone does allow or act as a sort of a gap, in that it allows us space to think, because without that absenting, we would not have any room to think. It would just be bright light, completely indecipherable, and zero meaning. So there's something about that process of absenting excess into the unconscious that is itself the production of a gap required for creativity. And yeah, it's there's a lot of working parts, but I'll leave it there.
That's really interesting. I'm going to pass it to Dimitri and Javier. So there's almost a way in which so there was no time. There would just be the picture of this bookcase. There's actually a bookcase right here. And in a way, if there was no time, I wouldn't be missing out on anything, right? Because it would just be the picture of that bookcase. The issue is that there's a problem to believe picture thought is truth, I guess we could say, is because there's time, right? And by their time is in a way always absent, right? There's a way in which the future and the past are absent, and I'm always kind of moving into there's kind of lack. And precisely the movement of time almost creates an opening for the next scene of my experience to enter into. So there's some sort of coming in, making space for the movement of time to enter to become a new picture thought that then comes in, makes a space where it kind of moves. So I have this movement here. I have to think of that, but let me pass it to Dimitri Javier. Yes.
Can I jump in on that?
Yes.
I forgot to mention something about that. There's something about time that I think is really important, which is that my view of time anyhow is that it's time is essentially a measure of relation, and that's corroborated by physics on a number of levels because of time collapses at Planck scale. So or the faster you go, the more you are interrelating with everything around you because the speed is connecting you. So you're sort of becoming everywhere at once. So that's why light experiences no time, because it's sort of moving too fast and thereby compressing its experience of relation to everything else by being everywhere at once. You understand? So there's a collapse of time that happens through excess. And when we are in the zone, or when we experience that overwhelm, what happens? When we are self-absented, time seems to disappear. You can be in the zone and suddenly you don't experience time. And that lends itself to my theory, which is that the reason time absents itself is through the excess of relation of thought itself. So you have this overwhelm, you're completely inspired, that's rubbing up against the limits, it's creating an internal saturation of mental relation, essentially, which then absents the internal subject's experience of time and stabilizes it in a sort of inertia. So you just enter this zone where time collapses in on itself. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out.
That's really good, and I'll pass it to Dimitri Javier. It makes me think, so just live thought. It's almost like you have the first step is kind of picture thought. Then after that is maybe imagination, and then it's almost like flow. I know that's a catchword now. I don't want to make that the expert, but it's like flow is almost this excess of imagination where time kind of goes away, but you're in the moment. It's not like ignoring of time in the picture thought, but it's also not a concentrated imagination that isn't totally carrying you away. So almost picture thought, imagination, flow. But anyway, let me give Dimitri Javier.
Yes, so we were talking about the imaginary before, and since the register of the imaginary is based on images and pictures, it's basically about sameness and difference, right? Like either I can identify with an image with someone's face, for example, or I cannot identify with it. I said that the analyst, these like either the identifications or the disidentifications is they must be set aside by the analyst, because it ultimately prevents you from, like, if I would go to a psychoanalysis and I can identify with my analyst, we would get friendly, and I cannot cast him into the role of a big other, right? Of like a master kind of figure. But the thing is, what happens here, like, so inevitably he should be cast into the role of the big other, which is about symbolic relationships instead of like an imaginary relation. And this is where anxiety comes up, right? Anxiety about whatever it be, symbolic anxiety, work, success, relationships with family. And like the really difficult thing here is that the analysant will continuously try to either identify or disidentify, maybe even rival with the analyst if he feels like they can identify on some kind of basis, like, drawing on Girard, something like this. But when you as a psychoanalyst have successfully are in a session and you've basically succeeded at bringing the analysant into a transference with you, like that's basically where, in some sense, they have kind of some kind of ultimate image of you as the other. Anyhow, you at least are very important in their own symbolic mediation, maybe even symbolically determine them. But then you kind of rule over the image. I'm still trying to think it. I haven't gone to psychoanalysis personally, but I can kind of imagine how it would go. And there is also a separation that Lacan makes between demand and desire, right? And about alienation and separation. And this is relevant to what we were talking about before, about absolute knowing. So when I'm alienated, I'm still, Hegel kind of talks about it in a similar way, you know, like in the introduction, I believe it's the introduction, might be the preface of Phenomenology of Spirit. He says, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it is not burdened by any something alien anymore. And I always love this so much because it sounds so preposterous even, and crazy. Like, how can I not be burdened by something alien? Isn't that some defining feature that makes me me? And the move from alienation to separation is actually where you can separate the demand of the other from the desire of the other.
Well, no, there's something about where in the act of imagination, you can create a big other, but the act of imagination is also a necessary step on, say, we were saying, like between picture, thought, imagination, and flow, if we just use that language for now. But it's so easy to get stuck, say, in imagination, where it doesn't reach an excess, or you don't let it take you, that then it actually becomes, say, a big other that you are using as an escape, right? So it is interesting to see all of the risks that there are on this sort of journey or this development of thought that we're putting forth. So it's interesting, like in Lacan, the imagine. But let me give it to Javier.
And I don't know how controversial I want to be with my topic
Christmas,
time.
ultra controversial. Christmas is the time for controversy.
Mainly because, I mean, you know, Daniel, I've been working on timing, language of time, and I made a distinction between a language of time and then the language of time. And what I've noticed is that when we speak of time in a real literal way, we are always telling time. We're telling time. And what's fascinating about language is that even when we have like regular discourses with people about, hey, I wish we could meet tomorrow. Can we meet today? Hey, I'm running late. Our language of time is a reflection of our desires, really. That's what it is. It's actually not about time. Even the very construction of a linear time is a desire for sequence, order, and structure. This is my controversial take, basically. So what happens when there is the language of time? Well, this is where I argue that time actually becomes visible, right? Because actually I agree with Chetan's point that there's, just like imagination, there's a point where time becomes visible. For the most part, time is sort of like this absent thing because we actually never talk about it. It's sort of like a generalized apophatics going on when we're talking about time, because really what it's saying is when we tell time, we're really telling about ourselves, really. So in this sense, I always kind of equate it with like a confession. But anyways, the notion that there is the language of time is the event, in which, because of the event, we're always telling of the event. We can never show the event. This is the language of time. That means that when I create a philosophy, I am indicating, I am telling of the event. I can only ever tell of the event. I can never show the event. And that means even when I construct my own philosophy of timing, I am negating myself because I am telling. I am telling of the timing. I am telling you. And yet, what I like about my thinking is only because I put myself in a position to where I have to make a decision. The risk is that I have to make a choice and translate anyways. I have to tell you, I have to confess that this is what I think it is. And I think imagination definitely plays in this same realm. Because remember, and I know Chetan remembers, when we were reading Ibn Arabi, imagination is not just the act, but it has an ontological realm, right? And I think this ontological realm is very similar to what Alex was talking about. Like, you know, when you wake up, like, you're like, everything's blurring, and then you like have to make everything into focus, and then, you know, and there you go. So yeah, this is what I'm still thinking between the language of time which we use and then the language of time, which seems in essence always a telling, and then it's always because we're always too late because we're telling of the event. The same way with being late is that you promise to arrive, and because you promise to arrive, that means that also a philosophy of time is something that never arrives because it's being late. It's always late. But it has the promise to arrive. This is deeply Derridian and Caputo, but you know, that's my point.
Derridian, boy, that rolls off the tongue. Derridian, my goodness. I'll pass it to Cheetah. It makes me think, if I say the word water to you, there's a way in which I make water appear in your head, but the word water doesn't equal the phenomenon. So there's a way in which I've negated the phenomenon in the statement of the word, but at the same time made it more present than had I not said it. This is what's so freaking weird, right? Like before I said the word water or dog dressed in tutu, a dog dressed in tutu was nothing. But then when I say dog dressed in tutu, it's a lack. It's a present absence, to use the language we talk about with Thomas Jogging. So the speaking of dog and tutu is not a dog in a tutu. So it's a kind of negation of the phenomenon. And yet at the same time, in that very negation, it makes it more present than it would be if I didn't say it. And this seems to be almost the structure of how thought works in a really weird way. This double making present in the very act of trying to trick you into thinking it's the thing when it's not. The making present in a negation. But let me give it to Cheetah. And I may or may not have a dog in a tutu. I'll let you guess.
I just want to first ask, Ebert, what do you say, time as a measure of relation or time as an experience of relation? Oh,
I said something like that, yeah. Time as not an experience of relation, but as a, for lack of a better word, a measurement of relation. So that when, yeah.
And who said this? So which thinker did you quote here? You quoted something.
I'm not quoting anyone there but myself.
It's mic drop. Bam. It's Ebert.
Yeah.
It's just gleaned from a number of disparate concepts and some of them facts, or facts. Yeah.
It's a very interesting way to put it, actually. Very, very interesting way to put it, because I myself have always thought at a time as a question of economy for human beings in many ways, because if you in some senses, so if you think about this question of plurality or multiplicity in that sense seriously, with this relationship to unity, you would always find a certain kind of economy that negotiates these two realms. You cannot, for instance, if you're sort of stopped in a particular moment and you can't move from there, the whole eventually gets lost to you. And if you're only moving through these moments, then any particular now becomes, in that sense. So time is always, in some senses, a question of economy. So it's a very interesting way of putting that question of economy, for at least for me, in my own mind. Just to add to this kind of a question or thinking, time has actually two aspects to it. I'm reading Hannah Arendt these days. She writes it very nicely. There's a cyclical aspect. And if you look at how nature experiences time, in some sense, animal kingdom, nature, it always experiences time cyclically. What Arendt sort of talks about, this distinction between eternity and immortality. Human beings experience time not only cyclically, but they experience time through a rectilinear sort of linearity also in that. It's not that we only experience in a linear way, but we can also, the true human experience is to experience time in a linear fashion, that we are moving forward. So there's a link between repetition and, you know, newness that comes out within this relationship with time that we share as human beings in that sense. And if time is to be thought through this economy with the gap, then automatically, you know, this link between repetition and newness immediately sort of gives rise to something like time for us. You know, the experience of time, which is in a certain sense an experience of, or linked to certain questions of movement. So it's, you know, even Newton's problem of time was exactly this question, that before Newton, people thought things at rest and things at movement are different. What Newton showed to us was when things are moving, they can be considered to be at rest. The same laws apply. You know, if you look at the first law of, I think, motion, that if something is at rest, will remain at rest, something in motion will remain at motion until an external force is applied to it. So he brought those two things into relation in that sense. So now if we start thinking about you know, this kind of a distinction that Arendt is bringing for us, a distinction between cyclical and rectilinear time, a distinction between, so basically says it that, you know, finding immortality through your deeds by completely affirming death. You're not trying to negate that, you're trying to find immortality with your deeds. And eternity is a way of completely negating death itself, finding this eternal you know, point through which the time itself gets negated in some senses, where time itself simply becomes a circular object for you, where you remain forever in that sense, where you have no relationship, where the life and death itself gets blurred to some degree. And if you start thinking through that question, there is something interesting about, and I don't want to get too long, but there's something interesting about this issue of speed and time that Ebert is bringing in some sense. And as the speed increases, you lose your relation to other things, and that is how, you know, light speed is constant, but time is not in some senses, you know. And I'll just stop here, but we'll go on, I think, later on.
Oh, I love this distinction. I think it's very important between immortality and eternity. Immortality is I call media the immortalizing machine, or the the immortalizing machine, in that it takes a frame of us and extends it out indefinitely. So it does both. It's an eternalizing machine because it takes the image and it extends it out, even if it's just a cage painting, from one day to the next, 1 year to the next, and just freezes that image across time. So that sort of is an eternalizing mechanism. But what the effect within us, I think, is immortality, because we know we're going to die, but that will continue. We have sort of frozen us within a kairotic moment, a non-chronic moment, such that our image will live out chronologically. And there's a lot of sort of like time within time, and this relationship between chronos and kairos. Let's see. Like what Javier was saying about, we're only ever able to tell time. We're never telling the event. We're never present for the event. So we never really get to produce the event when we're speaking. But I wouldn't sell yourself short, right? Because we've all been in a movie or in front of someone speaking, and suddenly we start really feeling, sort of like what Daniel was saying, something like a really great poet. We suddenly start feeling this thing as if we're really there. And my mouth starts watering, and, you know, because the mind is this incredible thing. So I think the aim in a lot of ways of language, and the fun aspect of the limitations of language, are that there are infinite number of ways to tell the story, and some of them produce something closer to the experience than others. And so we're constantly, like, you know, bending things backwards and trying to find new loopholes and wormholes. Last thing, just for anyone who happens to be watching this, who, you know, happen to be, and I know that Dimitri is gone now, but in my opinion, Lacan's imaginary register, imaginary order is quite different. It's related, but it's quite different than our wide-ranging conversation about imagination. And So I think that there was some cross speak going on there, but yeah, just to say that, you know, the imagination of what someone else, you know, represents to you and what you represent to yourself, and the mirror stage where you suddenly see yourself as other, all that shit is very interesting, and requires, in a certain sense, imagination, but in a large part, those images of the imaginary order are actually inherited and sort of foisted upon us. So anyhow, yeah, with that, I'll pass it along.
No, but anyways, it's so good to see you guys, Alex, Chitan, Javier. It's great to Daniel. It's great to see you guys. Great to be here. Great to hear the conversation. I was thinking of a question for you, Javier, on the event and this idea of only being able to tell. And I was wondering, is that because we can't show it because we didn't really make the event? Like the event is like not like we participate in it, but it's not something we can kind of like produce. That's the whole point. It's like unexpected and unanticipated, or it's anticipated, but we don't know what it is, right? It's expecting the unexpected. So is that why we can't show it? Is it just like it was like a glimmer? It was just like a blip, and so therefore it's just like it's so passing. It's kind of like when you're like, look, like there's a star outside and it's moving. It's like a shooting star, and then like, you know, your friend finally catches up to come outside, and they don't see it, you know, because they missed it. So what do you think on that?
That's a good question, Michelle. So some of the problems that I've been thinking through are like, you know, situations where, and I like to bring like personal situations and such that, for example, when your friend has a problem, right, and you tell them the solution to this problem like millions of times, and then all of a sudden something happens and he's like, hey man, you're totally right. And you're like, yeah man, I've been telling you that. And you're like, he's like, yeah, I know, but I had to experience it, you know? See, that's the part where I'm like, we're constantly telling, and yet at the same time, there's a sense of timing, which none of us could have ever prepared for, right? Like the very idea that, you know, we have this hopeless situation, like, you know, my friend's a drug addict or something like that, and we keep trying to make him go into rehab, and we keep trying, like we keep hoping, we keep telling him like, hey, you need help, and all of a sudden something happens, right? And you're like, and he's like, yeah, like I get it now. I've been, you know, traumatized, and this is why I'm taking drugs, and you're like, yeah, but I've told you that, you know. So there is a way that we do participate in the event. The problem is, my issue is that we try to make the event happen. I think that's my main issue. We try to make the event happen. The beauty of it is that we're there, we have participated in the event despite us not knowing when the event will happen or if the event will happen. It's essentially a maybe. But when it does happen, and I think Alex was right, and I didn't go into like my other portion of my timing thing, was that, you know, when they talk about evidence, you know, when something big happens, they try to get witness accounts. What's funny is that if we tell the same story, it kind of makes the event suspicious about it actually happening. But the very fact that there is a multiplicity of voices giving different interpretations about that very event actually verify the event itself. And that's something that I enjoy about, you know, my thinking about this idea of telling time, because it's like, even though we can always tell the event, we're always telling about the event, it's the very multiplicity of voices that tell the event that verify the event itself, which I really enjoy. And something that Daniel have been thinking, because, you know, we talked about deconstruction the last time. My problem is that we have this dismissive tone with subjectivity. We go, everything's subjective. Fuck it. My opinion is valid. Your opinion is valid. Okay. No, like this is like what I've been trying to think through. And this is why I like the term confession, because confession is you acknowledge in the very telling of it that there's something weak about your interpretation. There's something folly about your interpretation. Why is this folly necessary about your interpretation? Well, it's because if you acknowledge the folly of your interpretation, you allow the existence of the other without transgressing the other. So the very fact that we have this ability to be like, no, everything's subjective. Like the moment you do that, you're trying to protect your own interpretation. You're trying to protect its weakness, its very weakness of it. And that's why I'm like very adamant, and I got very adamant about like trying to think this out, like what kind of form of subjectivity allows us to be open to the many. And the only way I can think of it is that we have to acknowledge a sort of folliness to our interpretation. But the thing is, we have to interpret. We have to decide. We have to translate. That's the risk of it all. That's why it's a confession. I already did what I did. Forgive me, Father. I did what I did. And so yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Michelle.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Javier.
Can I ask a follow-up? I got a little confused. What for you is the difference between saying everything's subjective and confessing that your subjective point of view could be subjective?
That's a good question. So, in my opinion, a person that's confessing wouldn't say that everything is just like subjective. The moment someone says your opinion is subjective, you go, okay. And you allow this space for the other to like, so tell me what you think about such and such, right? Why is my opinion not valid or something like that? Basically what happens is when someone says your opinion is invalid, right? We have to allow the other to show us a possibility of the folliness of our interpretation. So that's why like I like the idea of like confessing, right? Because what happens is, for example, like this is exactly what you're doing to me right now, right? You're asking a question and saying, hey, your point might be not good, right? And I have to be like, oh shit, it might not be right. You know what I mean? But that's the confessing part. But the problem, the issue with the people that are not confessing is that they think that their argument, their opinion is just as strong as the other's opinion. But the thing is, the moment that you believe your opinion is just as strong as the other's opinion, you're transgressing the other. You're not allowing the other to show itself because you want to protect your opinion. You become a one. You're trying to become a one and not open to the many. So it kind of has to do with my tension relativity theory, which is why I've been obsessed with trying to work out the philosophy of timing. Because the moment there's tension, that starts displaying the weakness of my interpretation.
Would it be then that, in a way, what I'm hearing is that I would, if I'm the subject who's trying to confess, I would admit to my own subjectivity, but not draw my attention to yours, or somehow hold your, because the problem I'm getting into, I think it's a great and really rich subject, is that, like, for instance, what I more gravitate toward is knowing that I'm 100, or feeling completely in the throes of like, oh my God, my idea is right. Oh, here it is. This is amazing. Listen to this. And then risking that knowingly or unwittingly, and then having you knock it back, and then having to grapple with that like moment of the fall, so that I do sort of negate your experience, then you negate mine, and then I have to like access like ego, like, like humility and that whole process. But I'd love the idea of an easier path that's just as rewarding or just as rich. But I'm confused as to if mine is relative, then I secretly know your opinion is relative or is subjective. So then I would theoretically take your opinion less. I'm having trouble imagining it as a non-protective. You described it as a protection of your own point of view, and I'm having trouble getting out of that mindset and seeing it as a non-protective.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess it just depends, like the way I interpret, because like when people say this term, like well, it's all subjective anyways. I do find it like they're trying to protect their subjectivity by deferring to other subjectivities. Like that's how I interpret it. Now I could be wrong, like maybe it's not protecting. But I do feel like in often cases when someone kind of gets upset, and I've noticed this with my friends, right? They start getting upset and like, well, it's all subjective anyways, right? Doesn't matter. It's like they're protecting themselves from having to go inside that deep rethinking of their own concepts and ideas. And so that's why I feel like when it's like a confession is when you're confessing, you're giving a role for the other to play. But I feel like when we're having a strong subjectivity, we're not giving a role for the other to play. We're saying, this is how it is. And if you don't agree with me, then fine. That's all subjective anyways. Doesn't matter.
I see. So there's something actually, okay, so now I'm grokking it differently. So the person I'm exclaiming myself to is the priest or something. And what I like about that is that there's a shyness or an embarrassment, like an inherent embarrassment, that I'm so committed to the idea that I'm aware of the risk. So I think we're talking about, in my view, is always being aware of the risk of certainty, and that that risk of certainty produces a shyness or a humility that alters the delivery of the idea such that it makes room for the other, because there's an awareness of the, what I would call like absolute certainty of failure of everything. It's like whatever I'm certain of, I know is at some point going to fail, and having an awareness of that produces this sort of confessionalism dynamic.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You said it better. That's exactly right.
Gotcha.
That was beautifully put. It makes me think of, if we use that structure I keep using of the journey, it's almost like you start in kind of, you could say relativism. Well, it's all just your opinion. Then you can go to certainty, which is, well, actually there's an objective standard. And then you actually move to confidence, which is the interplay between, no, there is something other than me, but I'm actually responsible for how I conform to it or observe it or choose not to conform to it, and find a place of certainty. So often people associate certainty with highest form of knowing, but actually I think it's not. Actually, certainty is a cutting out the other. So you kind of cut this empty relativism, but then you have certainty, which only works if you cut out others, because others are always a threat to certainty because of difference. But then you have confidence, which is the ability to hold what you believe in face of difference, and to also acknowledge when difference is right, or when you should make space for difference. But that becomes active thought. That becomes working in different things. So a few thoughts that came to mind to bring on your confession. So on this question of imagination, thinking, and so on and so forth, it makes me think of what is one doing when you encounter a mistake? So for example, you thought that the stock market would go up and do very well. You were thinking it, you believed it, and then it turned out it crashed and you lost all your money. Were you imagining or were you thinking? And there's something interesting that occurs in error where you have to confess to yourself that you were imagining, not just objectively thinking, which then is a confession that unveils the entire nature of thought itself, of which thought that is mistaken must be experienced as correct as thinking that is correct, actually. And that's some sort of confession of the nature of the world that is other than you, that one does two things. Error, mistake is quite a revelation, for it actually shows that there's a distinction between you and world, you and other, and that thought must necessarily present itself as if it is not imagined, that it is accurate and that it corresponds, or otherwise you would know it was wrong and therefore you'd be correct. You would experience knowing it was wrong as correct, you see? Thought that you actually act according to must necessarily be experienced as thought that you believe corresponds with actuality. So there's a certain revelation there about how in the very structure of thought are the same mechanisms of error creation, of which then we kind of associate with fantasy, imagination, fiction, and things like this. So that phenomenological experience to me brings together the fact that thinking and imagination seems to go together. And this is what I'm thinking. So you're correct, Mr. Ebert, on Lacan's imaginational register is different than the fictitious imagination that we're talking about. But there's something about where the same mechanism of, say, creating the big other, therefore believing that that other is worth submitting myself to, is simultaneously a valuation that might be similar to imagining the Middle Earth of J.R. Tolkien and believing that's worth reading, right? There's a certain valuation in the act of imagination that can occur, that it is worth imagining, that can lure you into it, that then makes you like, so it's like you're like giving yourself over to it, but it seems problematic. So this is what's kind of interesting to me. So there's this way in which the big other is problematic, but then the giving yourself over to something bigger than yourself in flow is good, right? So what's the difference between this kind of big other, problematic other, and also this losing yourself in something that seems to actually be a positive thing, or self-forgetfulness, right? So big other is bad, but self-forgetfulness requires a kind of space of other that you can access into, right? So what's the difference between those things? And I'm wondering, it seems to be a matter, because the other thing I wanted to say as I bring in all these different thoughts at the end here, because I'm a cruel person, there's something what we seem to do is other imagination. Like we make imagination a kind of other. We other it as, oh, that's just fantasy. Oh, that's just fiction. That's not real thought. That's just imagination, which then seems to be a kind of self-deception mechanism to make us think that our thinking is pure. There's no imagination in it. It's just thinking. So it's accurate and it's reliable. So there's a way in which we want to separate imagination and thinking, as opposed to having them deeply interwoven, so that we can convince ourselves that we are actually always right? It's like self-confirmation. And then there's no risk of confession, in the sense that Javier is saying, right? Because you never have an error that would confess to you, where you would have to confess that they actually are intertwined together phenomenologically in ways where you can't easily identify them together, right? So there's this way in which we other imagination. Whereas if we're always in the business of imagination when we think, then we cannot other it. And then the question simply becomes, how do we treat it? And I think it's similar to subjectivity. Like if we other interpretation, oh, that's just interpretation, then we don't interpret, we actually read. It's other people who interpret, right? So we also have this tendency to other interpretation, so that we can actually gain ourselves certainty and not have to worry about the active thinking of confidence, because we actually just take in the world as it is. But once you own the fact that you have to be interpreting and thus have to be using the vehicles of imagination, then what it means to think is quite different. And then you start going, well, picture thought is not adequate. You have to move into imagination and different things like that, right? And then the question becomes, how does one live out their imagination in such a manner that it is in the direction of, say, flow, as opposed to big other, right? Because you can make how many people like live their lives for imaginations of like, they live for cosplay or fantasy, or they're always watching TV, or they're always desiring something. So there's a kind of big other in all of that. And it seems to me, it's almost like, I don't know what to think. It's almost like you have, if we use that structure one more time, and then I'll pass it. If anyone has final thoughts, we have time for that. It's almost like you start off in, it's like big me, which is an egotist. Then you can move to where you acknowledge the other, which is good, but then you can fall into big other, which is problematic. And it's almost like you have to then move into big, with me in parentheses, because it's like the excess, the bigness, the ability to see like self-forgetfulness is actually the stage you enter into. So it's like big me, egotist, other, which is good. You need to take seriously the other in your thinking, but then it's tempting to turn them into a big other, which does your thinking for you, and you just live for like the totalitarian dictator or whatever. But then you move to a place where there's a bigness, but the me is in parentheses, like that excess, that flow, which then I think would align with the, we were talking about the difference between immorality and, say, eternity. I talk about timelessness and eternity, but immorality is almost like what the desire is of the big other is to find, or the big me is desires of immortality, of finding something to make you immortal. Whereas something that you could associate more with like eternity or a transformation is the bigness, the vastness that you're forgetting yourself in and being part of, not from a place of deconstructing yourself, but in listening to the confession of that bigness to you that changes how you carry yourself in relation to it. And so there seems to be some sort of movement. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that it is only by not othering imagination that one would even carry out the process of developing thought to a place of the possibility of quote unquote bigness with me in parentheses, as opposed to big me or big other. So you have to have this movement in one's very orientation of the business of which thought is in. And I would associate that with absolute knowing, because I associate absolute knowing with a certain state that transforms the way you think, and time that I actually associate with what I call the here-there-ness of when you read a book and there's like a movie playing in your head. You're just looking at like words on a page, but you're also looking at a movie in your head. You're in like this kind of double being that's kind of going on. There's something that I associate with absolute knowing about that, but that's all in the paper. But let me give it to Javier, and then if anyone has final things to say on this lovely December 1st, please go right ahead.
The people that like entertain themselves with such a big other in terms of like, you know, cosplay and these imaginative worlds and virtual reality and everything else. In my experience, those people, when they entertain a realm that is completely imaginary, there seems to be something that happened that wanted them to stay there rather than be here in the world. And I think Jung actually talks about this a little bit, where he says like the man that took a risk and then he screwed himself over, he becomes like this, he minimizes himself, he shrinks himself. And so he accepts this otherness of which he cannot he cannot become anymore. Like he took a risk, he failed, and now he's just like, I'm never going to take a risk again in my life. So he just lives his life being this lesser of which he's afraid to take a risk of. And it's kind of funny in the sense of like, it's almost like he's afraid to confess in a real way that I made a mistake. Because even though the mistake happened and it occurred, he almost doesn't like the fact that the mistake happened, that he messed up. And so there's a way in which he's also denying the event in some ways. He's like denying that it happened, because he's like, I just won't do it again. That'll never happen again. Never. So those are the thoughts that kind of like, you know, when you were saying about that, it did make me think about that there is this sort of self-relating negativity going on if you don't confess. If you don't really confess. And there's like two sides to this, right? There's the more what how did Jung call it? Like there's like the God ego thinks he is God. And then there's like the man that got defeated, and then he's sort of self-relating negativity himself, to which he can never recover from, basically. In which case, in my opinion, both confession would bring you back to the state of allowing you to take a risk again, right? The whole point of like confessing is that you confess and then you go, okay, let me take a risk again, right? Let me do what I thought was a good idea, you know? And then you're back again on your knees going, forgive me, Father, what should I do? But I don't want to make it strictly theological, but I think it's a helpful model to understand, like, you know, you're giving a role for the other to play in this case. But I'll end it there.
I think I'm just going to try and tie as much as I can together, but also introduce this idea of the big other. So the Lacanian idea of anxiety is what is the other thinking of me? I can never know what they're thinking of me. But to tie that into excess, the infant is born into this world of determinate forms, masks. They are told, that's you in the mirror, that's you. And all our lives we're inculcated to eventually acquire a determinate form and keep that determinate form. Find yourself, not find yourselves, find yourself. And then don't leave yourself, keep that mask, because otherwise you've lost yourself. And so it's all about sort of this determinate form. So the infant is born into this excess that it has to absent as the unconscious, and it becomes aware that everyone else is determinate and it isn't. And so there's almost an inherent embarrassment to our own internal excess, and so we long for a mask. We want this determinate form to shield our internal infinities. And the big other. So the big other, you know, there's this terror of what they think of us. So we have this mask to sort of create an opacity so that the big other, you know, can't see within us. But internally, we're sort of mortified of being revealed, to essentially be indeterminate, to not know who the fuck we are, to not really have a determinate identity, to really have no clue what the fuck is going on. All we are is overwhelmed. That's it. But we have this exterior, and it serves as this beautiful barricade so that we can actually enjoy our indeterminate interior if we're good at life. If we're good at life. But what I was going to say is that I think that the return of the child, which I have to put in the fucking paper, the return of the child for Nietzsche is the infant before they don the mask is essentially a monster, an intercategorical being that, you know, by Vervaeke's, you know, definition is a monster, because they're intercategorical. They haven't donned the determinate mask yet. And because they're sort of intercategorical, but because they're so innocuous and cute, we sort of just think of them as pure because they're intercategorical, and so they don't have any determinate form yet. Now, when an adult becomes intercategorical, it's a fucking monster, right? We can't categorize them, and we're like, oh, yeah. But the cool thing, and the thing that I've been working on, and it's part of, you know, Nietzsche goes into masks a lot, and so does Oscar Wilde, but in Beyond Good and Evil, is no matter what, you're going to have a mask. People are going to project a mask onto you if you don't put a mask on, right? We cannot control the collapsing. In fact, it's a quantum theoretical reality that whatever undergoes observation collapses. All their potential collapses into a determinate item, right? And in the same way, we operate in the same way. So we're afraid of the big other collapsing us. And so we put up these guards to sort of obviate their collapsing. So we're in control of the collapse. But we can also just be like the child and return to the state of the intercategorical monster, where we allow what I'm calling the intermask to be our mask. So we just allow others to mask us and maintain our mask for us so that we can turn our energy inward and experience the sort of replete absence of excess that is now our regained territory of being. And that's sort of the way to deal with anxiety in my experience so far, is like really, especially getting a little bit of fame and stuff, it's very difficult to manage what people think of you. It's impossible. And it's actually really terrifying and awful, and criticism is super difficult to take. But once you get to a place where you've taken enough criticism and you get to a place where you're like, you know what, fuck it. The more you misunderstand me, the more territory of myself I have to myself, the more territory of me I get to enjoy. And it dives in really nicely with things that Nietzsche has said about masks and whatnot, but it also addresses this issue of the other and the embarrassment of the sort of nudity of our infinities and how to collapse that, and blah, blah, blah. And just to live as intercategorical monsters. And by the way, do the same thing. Do the same thing as a favor for others. Collapse them, judge them, tell them like, oh, you're this, you know, put them through the same thing so that they can enjoy, so that they have to go through the same terrible crucible to eventually enjoy the fact that they're intercategorical monsters. And then we can all just mask each other and enjoy our replete interiors. That's it.
Alex, I have a question.
Yeah.
Because what you're talking about, it really reminds me of this concept of Cora that has been described in Plato, where it's because it's a very beautiful concept, even though I know as subjects we cannot be the Cora, but there's a way we can mimic the Cora in the sense that we receive everything but don't become anything. And this is something that I've been very fascinated by, the very fact that Cora itself is some type of receptacle that receives everything and doesn't become anything. And it's almost like, I almost feel like that's kind of what, correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost like you're kind of getting there in the sense of like, just give it to him. Just give it to him. Like, make him receive everything.
Yeah, because then you do receive, or you reflect nothing in return because you've received everything, and you can be everything to everybody and thereby negate the entire collapse. I swear to God, you know, I don't know if it's because I'm watching too much Curb Your Enthusiasm, but like really letting people talk shit about you or think anything about, like my neighbors hate me. Some of them, they're starting to warm up, but like I let the graffiti stay on my place because I actually like masks. I like people thinking that my place is abandoned, but my neighbors hate it because it's like driving down the value of the property. But just allowing the neighbors to talk shit has been so fruitful for me. Just walking my dogs and knowing that they're talking about me has been probably one of the most spiritual crucibles I've ever experienced. And anyway, yeah. But yeah, I like what you're saying. And actually, I bring up the Korah in the paper a little bit too. But yeah, I something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, just really quick. This is all really, really good, guys. Thank you all for sharing such insightful things. And yeah, I guess I wanted to ask you, Alex, the question of, I think you're quite right, and I think there's something really beautiful about this. I wonder for like, you know, a preteen or somebody who's going through all these masks that, like, let's say they're in like some dysfunctional family, and like, you know, unfortunately their parents are just, you know, really bad people to their kids or whatever, and like this kid is just kind of getting all these, you know, these basically like it's being told, you know, you're no good. It's awful. And like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, I get where we as maybe in like people at our age and maybe with our own acceptance of the openness and like the deconstruction to be able to not destroy but to like resituate, blah blah blah, like that can be super duper helpful. But how, I wonder how that can maybe, like, how can somebody get over the hump of like, or kind of, I don't know, make that leap of faith?
I've been thinking about that. I totally get that. Yeah, that's the question. And I've thought about it, and I actually have a paragraph in the paper I'll probably have to delete because it's way too it's gnarly. That said, you know, the period of the camel, or sorry, of the lion, is this sort of anti-masking, right? So there's the teenage sort of like anti-masking is a necessary part of the thing, and you don't anti-mask unless you get incorrectly masked. And so it's something that we all sort of have to experience is this you know, misjudging and whatnot. That said, I don't want to mismask my fucking daughter, and yet I know that, you know, there could be some positive, you know, outcomes of that, but ultimately, like, this is a conundrum. I talk about, you know, this could get me canceled, right? But this is, let me see if I can put this in a way that doesn't totally like kill me. White America has masked Black America, right? Let's just use the N word as the masking of Black America. Didn't really allow Black America to participate in the masquerade of their own volition in their own ways. There's an infinite sort of assortment of questions like, why is Black America so far superior to white America in terms of their internal expression? Now we could go like, oh, because they're from Africa and Africa had this and Africa had that. Yeah, but still, why are they so fucking incredible at self-expression? What's going on? There's some liberty happening there, and it's possible, totally, probably not true, but it's possible that by being denied mask management, the only thing that they were left with was their interiors. And sort of while white America is just managing masks and really engaged in this process of transparency, sort of essentially disgorging the interior and smearing it as the mask, there's a double movement there, because if you make your interior transparent, or make your mask transparent to the interior becomes the mask. And so you sort of like become this sort of you know, stone artifice. Meanwhile, you end up, you know, demonstrably white America is more uptight, less capable of free self-expression. So anyway, there's a possibility that, you know, and obviously most artists come from fucked up families. There's something going on from this, like, this being mismasked and then figuring out how to go inside. And I don't know if that's a legitimate connection, but you know, and I don't know how to answer your question, especially when we're talking about our own children, but I can say that from my own experience, being called, for instance, my dad thought I was dumb. He wanted me to go to trade school. He said I wasn't an intellectual and that I wasn't cut out for school and I needed to go work with my hands. I was 14 years old. It was the most crushing moment probably ever. I was so floored and crushed. Now, what did that do to me? It made me really pissed off at him, but it also made me like, fuck everybody, fuck all of this. I'm going inside. I'm a genius. Fuck you guys. And I had to come up, you know, and so what I ended up doing, I had the mask of a goofball because I actually ended up appropriating that. But inside, I started developing an entire sort of philosophy of like society, why it was so bad, why it was misjudging me. And so for me, it was ended up being a real benefit. Now I did end up becoming a heroin addict. Now that wouldn't be something I'd want to see my kid go through, but you know, yeah, I don't know. It's tough.
That was great. Thank you so much for sharing and for addressing the question. Appreciate it.
That was excellent. The extraordinary, brilliant, and masterful Bernard Hankins, spoken word poet, would always say that one of the reasons you see, say, ciphers, free verse develop in, say, Black communities is because if you don't have wealth or you're in lower class, you have to somehow figure out how to be creative with what you have. And what you don't, you know, a cipher, you can stand in a circle if you just have the people. So the very neglect of Black communities by white pushed in the direction of really emphasizing internal resources, where I would argue the creativity you see in, say, the hip hop cipher, especially if it's off the dome and there's nothing memorized, is arguably the highest form of creativity there is, in the same way that true jazz improvisation, or take someone like a Thelonious Monk. You know, the other thing you can say is one of the reasons why African-American art has to go in basically new forms of genre that are very improvisational based, not always, of course, is because white America will not let you play in the concert halls that they do according to their genres. If you try to play the music that they're playing, they're just gonna not let you play, right? So you have to do something unique that stands out, that if Americans want to see that kind of art, there's only one place to go, and that would be minority communities, right? So that very conditionality can force an emphasis on, it's basically like Raymond, we talk about kind of the unarmored test or nakedness. When you're naked, it actually can drive you to be more creative and more alive when you're denied things, because all you have is that resource. And actually what that ends up doing is, I think, to this idea of not identifying with the mask, Nietzsche, what I think is an unbelievable section, 360 of the Gay Science. He says something like this. He says, everyone has confused will with purpose. And that is what has screwed us. And basically the name of the game is to make sure will does not become purpose. Because we tend to think that if we will X, that's will. It's like, no, you have to avoid the temptation of letting your will become a purpose, because that's going to actually be what removes from you the capacity to be the child in that sense. Likewise, you have to keep yourself from identifying with the mask, but then the very effort of fighting masks in the same can be what makes you then get lost in that. So you have to you have to receive it, as opposed to constantly identifying with either the rejection of those masks, where you're fighting against them, or you're letting people put them on you, right? So you have to preserve that internal state that you're describing. And for Nietzsche, I would associate of defending your will from purpose, which is pretty hot, actually. That's a crazy idea, like defending your will from purpose. So likewise, what ends up happening in, say, white America, the notion is that you lose your creativity to your technologies, or to your creative act, to your instruments, to your concert halls, right? You would say, oh, you can play the piano. That must mean you're creative. Well, who's more creative? Someone who's creative on a piano, or someone who can somehow make music without an instrument? Now, this isn't to say instruments are bad, of course, but it is to say that it's very difficult to not have your technologies or your economy or whatever, your masks or socio-political, take some degree of your creativity from you, which is a threat to your will. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with, say, having a goal or a purpose, but the danger is the moment you do, your will is at risk. That's what Nietzsche is kind of suggesting. And if you assume that purpose equals will is doomed, because you're just going to, he said it's like confusing the steering with the engine, or like confusing steam from the lava core. Like purpose is just like it just comes off of will, but it is not equal to the will. Like it's a spark versus the fire. So likewise, playing an instrument in a sense is the spark. It's only possible because of the creativity, but the instrument itself is not the creativity, and maintaining that difference is really paramount. And basically what happens, like Bernard we would talk about, is that in African-American communities, you only have that will, because the society has denied from you access to the resources of which can rob from you that identification, which actually lends itself in intrinsic motivation. I think, and so for me, what you're talking about, so in my paper, like I have to make this distinction between, you know, I talk about the dangers of bestocentrism, but just because you avoid, the key word is centricism, just because you avoid bestocentrism does not mean there's no receiving or there's no bestowing at all. The issue is that it is primarily, if there is becoming, there has to be some degree of bestowing or giving to others. He'll even talk about like the bestowing of love in Zarathustra and different things. The issue is the identification of that, because actually, if you were to identify your becoming radically with the denial of any bestowing at all or receiving, well, then you would actually be so central, because you'd be thinking all the time about the mask or thinking all the time about the bestowing. In the same way, that's where this self-forgetfulness or this there has to be a kind of forgetfulness of the self, not through a deconstruction, but it's excess to where the very bigness of the entire process of mask putting on you and you letting it wash over, but while maintaining your will. Because it's much more difficult to maintain that internal will or that infinity you were talking about, Alex, when people are trying to put masks on you, as opposed to if you're off alone somewhere where there's no one trying to put masks on you, right? You may off in the desert no one may put a mask on you, but it's kind of cheap or it's a fragile sort of internal will because it's not tested. The key is to move into a space where people are trying to put masks on you and you maintain it. It's moving into a space where you're tempted to confuse will with purpose and you don't. It's moving into a space where you play the piano, but don't outsource your creativity to the piano or the socioeconomic order and so on. And it is very, very, very difficult to not have that occur. And it takes a radical level of internal resources to maintain that. And that's where I try to argue that that's kind of Nietzsche is pointing at in book 5 as a core thinker. And I think the more that we own that we are an active component in our thinking, as opposed to thinking is merely an empirical taking in of the world, you know, a realization, when you actively own the fact creativity, even when it is thinking of 2 + 2 = 4, is an act of imagination to some degree, and therefore an act of creation, and therefore an act of you, then you cannot avoid the involvement of you in your thinking, your life. And then the question is, how will you respond? What will you do? And will you rise to the occasion of yourself? And we have to go drive to Charlottesville now. So thank you so much. It's been a delight. Alex, I loved it. I have Chetan, Javier. Thank you. Michelle, thank y'all. Y'all beautiful people. Thank you so much.